All right, well, it is Good Friday. And in honor of the holiday, for those who believe and those who don't believe, and everything in between, I thought it would be interesting for me to read to you just a bit from one of my favorite books. And I like this book just as a work of literature. So I'm not getting into here whether the accounts of Jesus in the Gospels are true or not, or whatever. You can look at videos that I've done addressing my spiritual beliefs elsewhere. But I think this is a great book, and it is always one that I've enjoyed reading at every stage in my psychological and spiritual development or what have you. Now, it's called The Day Christ Died. It's by Jim Bishop, and this book was written decades ago, but it is an hour by hour account of the last 24 hours of Jesus's life. And of course, it's taking the gospel accounts at face value as fact, and you don't have to do that, right, to enjoy this. But what's interesting is, Jim Bishop was a journalist, and he was interested in taking the historical knowledge that we have about the time period and the location and the context in which Jesus might have lived, and all the various sociocultural and political and historical aspects of Jesus's environment and the context of what happened to him in the biblical stories. And so I think it is really interesting, and I think his writing is really beautiful. And so I thought I would just read just a bit from this. Now, I've always found the most compelling part of the gospel stories of Jesus to be the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think I'm not alone in this because, for instance, in Mel Gibson's controversial film, he starts that film in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you're not familiar with this story, the idea is that the night before, or the night that Jesus is arrested, he goes after the Passover meal, and after he's finished, his mission, and he's finished, or at least he's finished preaching everything that he needs to preach. He retires to this garden, this kind of olive garden, Mount of Olives, and he goes to this Garden of Gethsemane, and he tells his disciples to wait up for him because he knows he's going to be arrested later, right? And according to the story, and he tells his disciples to wait up for him, and they fall asleep, and he goes really to this area to just be alone and to pray, and he starts basically crying and begging God, if there's any way you can take this away from me, please do, please. But your will, not thine, your thine will, not mine, be done, right? And so shortly after, he breaks into a kind of a sweat of blood, and then he gets up and he is kissed by Judas, who appears, and then he's arrested, right? Probably know the story. Well, I think some of the writing here is really interesting. And so I want to read to you the chapter of this book about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when he is praying alone and contemplating, according to the story, what he's about to go through, the extreme suffering that he's about to go through. So we start in the book at 1 a.m. I told you that it's divided hour by hour. And I just want to read a little bit of this to you. And I hope that no matter what your beliefs or lack thereof or whatever, you'll find this to be interesting as I do. 1 a.m. The work was finished. There was an end to the preaching, an end to the miracles, an end to the instruction of the apostles, an end to prophecy. The time for waiting had come. There were about 90 minutes left of freedom, and there was nothing of consequence to do with them. Jesus had publicly audited his accounts to the Father in the presence of the chosen ones, and in these prayers he had prayed for himself first, as all good priests should do, and then he had prayed for the men who would carry his story of love to the people. He had closed with a prayer for all the faithful of all times. He's talking about what he had done at Passover, at the Passover dinner, the Last Supper. There was nothing of importance that had not been said or done, several times, some to the point of redundancy for the sake of emphasis. Jesus had offered himself to the world, and that part of it which had the best culture and the best understanding of a monotheistic universe had spurned him. If Jesus failed here in Palestine, how much more quickly he would have failed in Rome, the world of many marble gods, or in Greece, where man often had a better intellect than the gods he worshipped, or in Alexandria, or in Gaul, or in Carthage, or anywhere where men were afraid to die in everlasting darkness. And, as he knew when he had told the Father that he would consent to be born and to live as a man, and to die as a man, The moment of trial would be slow and terrifying, and his God side would not be able to save him a bit of pain, a shred of shame, or even shield him from the horror of anticipating the awful things that were to come. It was a time for waiting. He might have walked through the little grove in the full light of the waning moon. He might have sat in the cave with the 11 and talked of the time when they'd first met, of the time when many Jews up and down the land had come forward convinced that this was indeed the Messiah. He might have talked about the time only last Sunday, when hundreds of his people in a festive mood had acclaimed him as the Son of David, and their hosannas had rung up and down the road from Bethany to Jerusalem, the echoes dying against the gleaming pillars of the temple. They might have talked of triumphs. Instead, Jesus motioned to Peter and James and John. These three, in whom Jesus reposed special trust, walked with him out of the cave and across the little road of gray steps which stretched all the way from the temple down to the Cedron and up to the top of Olivet. They crossed these steps and walked into the shadows of that little olive garden. It was, it seemed, always warm there. The heights of the walled city were cool and breeze-swept, and even now one could see cloaked pilgrims walking in and out of the Golden Gate to the temple. It was cool on top of the Mount of Olives, too, but the valley places near the Cedron were warm and moist, and the last to see the sun. The three followed him. He stopped under the trees. In the pattern of foliage which blotted part of the moonlight, they saw the face of Jesus, and it held fear and horror. The long, slender hands shook. The features seemed to be gray, tinged with blue. The mouth was slack. The eyes were huge with a vision the others could not see. Peter and James and John tried to help. They wished to console. But the Messiah merely shook his head. He was beyond any help of man, precisely because he was now more man than God. As a man, he was able to sustain the fullness of suffering. And as man, Jesus had not only the nervous structure of all other humans, plus the emotional capacity for great joy in addition to a great sensitivity. But as the Son of God, he had a knowledge of what was to come. To them, he seemed to be immeasurably weary. And this was strange because only a few minutes ago he had been expounding the last of the lessons of the missionaries to them. And he had finished the work with vigor. They fell mute and turned their eyes away because they did not think that it was right to look upon the face of the Messiah in weakness and fear. He doubled his hands into fists and held them against his breast. "I am plunged in sorrow," he said loudly and bitterly. "Enough to break my heart." The three glanced at him sadly. Jesus looked up through the branches at the miniature beauty of 1,000 other worlds, and then he glanced once more at the temple, so near across the valley. "Stay here and keep awake," he said with entreaty. They nodded in silence and watched him make his way through the low-branched trees for a short distance. There he paused beside a big flat rock. He knelt for a few moments. Then, abandoning himself to overwhelming mortal fear, he threw himself full length on the rock, face down. In a loud voice he said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup be spared me." The lament came almost involuntarily from his lips. "And yet," he said, as though afraid to be afraid, "not as I will, but as you will." No one knew better than Jesus that if he died as the Son of God, the gesture would be small, the sacrifice negligible. From this moment until the hour when he expired, he knew that he would have to suffer much more than anyone else who might travel the same path and endure the same things. The mere waiting was almost beyond him. Every minute of every hour must now be borne as a man with extraordinary courage in order to achieve the victory of a God, the one God. It was at this time that young Mark, about 17 years of age, ran into the garden. He was panting, and he was in his night clothes. He went to the side of the road where the cave was, and, with excitement, told the 8 who had been sleeping there had been a raid on his father's house, and that there had been a great mob of men armed with clubs, led by Roman soldiers and temple guards, as well as some elders of the temple, scribes and Pharisees. And they had searched the premises looking for Jesus, demanding to know where he had gone. The neighborhood had been in an uproar, and many women were seen carrying torches, and some carried lanterns on top of long staffs. No, it said many, not many women. And many were seen carrying torches, and some carried lanterns on top of long staffs. The tribune and some of the elders had questioned his father, and then they had left. Some said that they were going to the temple. At this news, one of the 8 hurried across the road to tell Jesus, and not finding him, told it in whispers to Peter and the others who waited. No one, with the exception of the boy who brought the news, seemed alarmed. The apostles apparently felt that if the raid had failed at Mark's home, then that was the end of it. Their lack of concern could hardly have shown itself better than in the fact that the 8 on the other side of the road and the 3 who reclined against olive trees in the garden fell asleep. Now and then, John awakened and listened to the loud and fearful voice of Jesus. But in spite of his love for the Messiah and his natural compassion, the heavy lids of his eyes refused to obey his will and shut again. Thus in the little grove was the incongruous sound of the Son of Man beseeching mercy, and, mingled with it, the sleep-born noises of healthy men whose faculties had been short-circuited by fatigue. And so, in a real sense, Jesus was alone in the garden. As he prayed, his anguish deepened and became unbearable. He stood. He was close to a stupor of fright at the visions he had seen of the future, and he came back to the 3, perhaps to seek human solace. His agitation was pronounced. His body seemed older and bent forward. The hair, which usually hung smoothly to below his shoulders, was awry, and some of it was plastered to the sweat on his forehead. He looked down, and his heart ached as he saw the 3 disciples sleeping. John stirred and awakened, and jostled the others. "How can you be sleeping?" Jesus asked. "Rouse yourselves and pray that you may not succumb to temptation." He was dismayed at the sight of his defenders grunting apologies and trying to get to their feet. The 12 may have been originally chosen by his father, but he had granted these 3 special honors. Only Peter and James and John had been privileged to see his transfiguration on the mountain. Only these 3 had been present when he had raised the daughter of Jairus from the dead. Jesus went back to pray, now even further into the realm of agony than before. The 3 had fallen asleep again, almost before he had returned to the rock. This time he knelt, and his forehead touched the rock, and as he prayed, he rocked back and forth as though in deep physical pain. This, he knew, was the hard road to his Father. There was no other easier route. The nature of man is such that he must shrink from thoughts of his own death, more so when the body is well and not close to death. The man side of his nature became more and more pronounced as he dwelt upon the imminent dissolution of the bonds between the miraculously fashioned body with its sinews and blood and its bone structure and its mind, imprisoned by an inverted cup of bone, and yet free by the God-given power to think and to will. He considered the soul which would cling to this body until, in dreadful agony, the body died. The man side of his nature was not reconciled to death. Thoughts of it, after this many years of living within the body, were sickening. And yet, this had been his choice. He would come here, and he would die for man. Once he called out, "My Father!" He prayed, sometimes in rapid murmuring, sometimes slowly, distinctly, and loudly. Once he looked up above the rock and for a moment fell silent. He saw an angel. The sight was luminous, but he was not encouraged. The angel said nothing. The silence probably meant that his Father would do nothing to lessen the suffering of Jesus. He got to his feet, slowly and with the aid of his hands, and he went back to the men who were eager to lay down their lives for him. They were again sleeping. And as Peter half opened his eyes, Jesus half whispered, "Simon, are you sleeping? Were you not able to stay awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray, all of you, that you may not succumb to temptation." He sighed. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This was, at that moment, as true of him as it was of them. His flesh was so weak that all the strength of his soul could not keep it from betraying the will which made it function. The Lord, said Isaiah, would lay down upon him all the iniquities of mankind, and now the weight of countless sins pressed upon his shoulders as he knelt again to tell his Father that he would accept the cup. The salty sweat gleaming on his face and forehead began to change color. It reddened and deepened in hue until, in his agony, he knew that it was blood. It clung to his face and moved slowly down to his chin. Some of it dropped off in clots onto the rock, and some of it congealed in his beard. Medically, this is called hematidrosis. I probably just butchered that, sorry. This is called hematidrosis. It occurs when fear is piled upon fear, when an agony of suffering is laid upon an older suffering until the highly sensitized person can no longer sustain the pain. At that moment, the patient ordinarily loses consciousness. When that does not happen, the subcutaneous capillaries sometimes dilate so broadly that when they come into contact with the sweat glands, the little capillaries burst. The blood is exuded with the perspiration, and usually this occurs over the entire body. Luke, who was a physician, later wrote, "And his sweat became as clots of blood, trickling down upon the ground." If you like that, I'll read more. Or if you'd like me to start reading some of my favorite works of literature, yeah, let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this. Appreciate your comments. Subscribe, like, and the links for tips and donations are below as well. Happy Good Friday, believers, non-believers, whatever. I just wanted to share this book with you that I like.